So I am delighted to be talking to you, Professor David Nutt. You are a psychiatrist, a renowned psychiatrist, the Edmund J. Safra Professor of Neuropsychopharmacology, and you have many roles, but the one I'm interested in today is through your role as Chief Research Officer with Awaken, with the Awaken Clinics. You have vast experience and decades of research in the field of psychedelics. And I think maybe, shall we start with what led you to be so fascinated and spend so much of your life working on psychedelics?
Well, I came to it rather late. Neuropsychopharmacology means I study the effects of drugs on the nervous system, the brain. I'm a psychiatrist. I've been giving people drugs to treat their mental illnesses for 40 odd years, but I've always done research. And I think my claim to fame is that I've probably given more different kinds of drugs to human beings than anyone ever. And
wow, that is a claim to fame, isn't it? Yeah.
No one's ever challenged me yet. I mean, so I'll be interested. But so it's a lot. Almost pretty every class of drug, pretty much, I've done to study the effects and to understand, to use them to probe the brain as well as to understand the effects of the drug. And actually, in 1983, I did the first study of a drug which blocked the receptors in the brain that psychedelics work on, and it produced some strange effects. It produced a deep synchronized sleep, which was completely unexpected, and we had no idea why that was. But because the drugs, the agonists, the ones that would stimulate the receptors, were illegal, we couldn't study the opposite. So it was only about 15 years ago when I got old enough and near enough the end of my career to realize it didn't matter if I got into trouble. It was worth trying to do that last experiment, which is give people psychedelic drugs and see what happened. And it did exactly the opposite of the antagonist and produced profound alterations in consciousness, but also in brain circuitry. And it was those changes in circuitry which led us to think it might be useful for conditions like depression. And then we did the depression trials.
So for those who aren't so familiar with the language, what you mean by brain circuitry is that we can have kind of very limited negative thought patterns and networks, can't we, that get stuck, and then they build like pathways kind of into our brain that we get more stuck, and that's how you get treatment-resistant depression and other kind of conditions that nothing seems to touch. But I guess the question before that, because there was such early promise in the 60s and 70s with psychedelics, then you say you were kind of rebellious enough and I guess confident enough to use these drugs that weren't popular. What was the early promise and why were they stopped?
Well, the early promise was that they could treat a whole range of psychiatric disorders, from depression, anxiety, right through to addiction. A lot of people don't realize that the foundations of Alcoholics Anonymous were based on psychedelic experiences that the founder, Bill Wilson, had.
I didn't know that. I mean, I'm the biggest fan of AA and all of them, Al-Anon, all of the different, and his experience, what was that? That's amazing.
Yes, he did. He had a profound psychedelic experience. Actually, his was with a substance called scopolamine, which is sometimes used, not very commonly used these days. It was being used as a treatment for his alcoholism, for withdrawal, but it provoked a psychedelic experience in him, during which time he experienced himself in another place, as many people do with a psychedelic trip. He was on a mountain, he said. I was on a mountain with a wind, not of air, but of spirit was flowing.
Wow.
And then it burst upon me. I was a free man, and the shackles of his alcoholism burst then. And that's what set him up to develop AA. But from 1933 to 53, AA was driven largely by the 12-step process and the search for some higher being that he saw on this trip, but searching it without a trip. And then in 53, when LSD became available, Wilson took LSD. He gave LSD to Huxley. Huxley started with mescaline, but then Wilson gave him LSD and with Betty Eisner, and obviously Huxley became very famous for his psychedelic experiences. But Wilson realized that LSD was better than what he'd had before because it was produced a more reliable trip. And he encouraged the US government to fund 6 trials of 1 or 2 doses of LSD in alcoholism. And together they proved to be extremely powerful. The LSD treatment for alcoholism is more powerful, it's 3 times more effective. The number needed to treat is a third that of any current treatment for alcoholism.
That's unbelievable. So I don't know, so many things are going off in my head. So psychedelic is the broad term for different drugs: ketamine, MDMA, psilocybin, LSD.
Yep. Correct.
But all of those drugs change your circuitry of your brain and open up, expand it, so that you, from our kind of neuroplasticity, they feed into our neuroplasticity to kind of break through these very rigid kind of rabbit runs. Is that right?
Absolutely. Rabbit runs. I've never used that term. I might start using that. That's a great term, rabbit run.
Yeah.
It implies it's deep inside. Yeah. If I was to show you brain scans of ketamine, psilocybin, LSD, ayahuasca, DMT, 5-methyl, they're all the same. You can't tell them apart. They all produce this profound perturbation of connectivity in the brain. The one that's different is MDMA. MDMA does work in a different part of the brain, and it has, when we use it in a different way to the psychedelics. It doesn't disrupt thought processes. It allows you to better engage with your emotions during therapy. So that's the one exception. So
the thing that I've been really interested in learning about the Awaken Clinic, but also other people using psychedelics, is that the two-handed power of the integration of the preparation, the therapy, the trip, and then the integration from the therapy afterwards. So that I really don't want either of us to encourage people just to go and get some drugs and then they're going to be fixed. It's the whole kind of package, isn't it? Do you want
Absolutely.
to explain the thinking behind that? And
so the package is, well, let's just explain what the package is first. So the package is preparing people for what's going to happen, reassuring them that whatever's going to happen, they're going to be safe. The therapist will be with them, helping them work through scenarios where they could get the best benefit from the experience, being with them during the experience, which is usually a day or so later, and then after the experience, working with them to maximize the benefits of the insights and the understandings they get, and then building on that a psychotherapeutic relationship which can help them reformulate their lives. Because obviously for many people, they've had a chronic illness which has been really disruptive to their work, to their family life, their personal growth. They've got a lot to put back, and it can take some time to get all that reintegrated.
Because there has what I think would be unhelpful is to have this kind of idea, there are no magic bullets. This may exceed like 5 years worth of therapy, and you may be able to do a lot of much faster work than, say, seeing me every week. Because of the kind of power of the neuroplasticity, how it works with that. But it's the structure of the therapy, isn't it? And I guess from my view, and I was thinking, well, do I want to go and try this? And one is, maybe I'll have images in a bad trip of stuff that did happen to me that I'm very happy not knowing. And also maybe it will put me into a circuitry that is actually worse than the one I'm in now. So if other people have those questions.
Very common fears, yes. The answer is, unless you are suffering from a severe mental illness at present, which is unlikely, I think it isn't likely that you're going to be made ill by this.
So there's a level of, if you're extremely mentally vulnerable and fragile, this would be a risky treatment. Is that what you mean?
No. I'm saying is that generally people who aren't suffering at the time, as I presume you're not. No. So if you were using it if you're using it for self-exploratory purposes, the likelihood is you would have probably quite a fun trip. Patients who are using it to deal with problems like trauma or depression or addiction, those trips are much harder because we encourage them to go to places where they have been, which has caused the disturbance and has led to their illness. But and those are often quite challenging experience. They're difficult places to go to. I mean, so for instance, in one of our first trial of psilocybin, one of our patients said, during the trip, he actually saw his father abusing him.
Oh, that's horrible.
And he realized that was the cause of his depression. And he realized he'd shut it out from his mind. But he's still been depressed, because even though he was shutting it out, there was obviously something still, the residuum of that experience was keeping his mood low. But he was able in the trip to say to his father, that's it. Now I know that's the problem. You've done it to me. I know. I've got closure. And he's been well for 8 years afterwards. That's
an amazing thing. Because when I work with clients who have traumatized, I do EMDR, and I'm kind of known for working with grief and a lot of traumatic death. And one of the kind of messages that I understand from clients is that we need our defenses because it's too overwhelming experiencing the trauma all at once. Mm-hmm. But we need also to allow ourselves to feel the pain, and so that we change and grow through. We have the memory that the pain is the agent of change, so that our brain as a learning machine adjusts to this new reality, and we can live with that new reality, and we haven't blocked our capacity to feel by blocking the pain. And in some ways, what I understand from you is that the psychedelics kind of support you through your neural networks to face that pain that you can't kind of you can't let yourself do without them.
Yes, a lot of the stress, a lot of the emotional and kind of mental tension and a burden of illness is for people trying not to remember.
Yes.
Pulling back, forcing away those traumas, bring them to the surface, that's the sort of classic psychotherapy, to get them to the surface, deal with them, and then you sort of clean them out. Well, psychedelics allow them to come to the surface in a way which you can deal with them very rapidly.
Yeah.
Because it's a powerful insight. The thought loops the repressive loops are broken down. They come forward, you deal with them, and then with the integration afterwards, you can reset your mind as you try to do in ordinary psychotherapy. It's just that you've achieved the sort of target interaction much quicker.
Yeah, I really understand that. I had a client who went to a clinic, and she had a really good experience, and then she went a year later, and because she dealt with the initial trauma, when she went later, that kind of that freed her from a lot of generalized anxiety. And so that, I guess this is something that maybe people would do, different phases of their life. You don't have to be only traumatized. So what would, for Awaken Clinic, people listening to this and they're asking themselves, shall I go to the clinic? What would be a green tick, yes, go, and a cross, not to go?
Well, you can only go to the clinic. You can only get treatment if you fulfill the criteria of being ill and having failed on 2 other treatments. So
okay, that's quite a high bar.
Yes, and that's partly because ketamine isn't licensed, it's off-licensed medication. That was the deal we had to agree with the Quality Care Commission to make sure that we were not giving people who were not mentally ill fun trips. But to look at the bigger picture that you touched on, there are two aspects of that. There are definitely people in whom the treatment's effective, but the depression comes back, in which case it's perfectly sensible to have another dose. And the other side of the coin is, can we use this kind of therapy perhaps to stop people getting ill in the first place, or to protect people against? And that's a very open question. I mean, it's ethically much more challenging because the drugs are illegal. But if they weren't illegal, then I think there'd be quite a bit more research looking to see whether these, they do produce resilience and help people do better in life generally. They increase well-being. Make people more in touch with other people, more in touch with the rest of the world.
I think it's something about trust, isn't it? When I've watched a lot of the Michael Pollan and your big program on the research that you did, it's fear that shuts us down. And if we kind of can trust, that opens us up.
Yes, that's right. And this is actually, but that's particularly interesting in relation to MDMA, because MDMA is largely used for PTSD. And as you know, the problem in PTSD is not the fact that people have been traumatized. That's the origin of the problem. but it's the fact that the emotions return as they were at the time of trauma.
It's as if it's
every time you think exactly you're back
the past is in the present.
Exactly. And what
The
MDMA
world is through a traumatic lens. Yeah.
And your brain doesn't well, intellectually, you know, you're not in the battlefield, you're not being run over, but your brain doesn't, because your brain has encoded that the emotions of that event. And MDMA can keep that emotional tone down enough for you to actually engage in the therapy rather than just faint or dissociate or run out of the room as people have done in the past.
That's extraordinary. So the other thing I was thinking about is you're doing this phase 3 because a big part of what you do is at Imperial.
Yes.
I worked under Imperial. I was at St Mary's for 25 years, and now I'm on the ethics committee of Imperial. So I have a great fondness for Imperial. But you're doing a phase 3 clinical trial for MDMA for addictions.
No, Juliet.
Sorry, put me straight.
I think you're talking about the ketamine trial for alcoholism.
Okay, yes, that is what I got the wrong word.
Well, okay, sure, because we are thinking of doing an MDMA study, but that's not funded yet, so I don't know that they wanted you to talk about.
Talk to me about the ketamine one.
So one of the big breakthroughs that's happened and one of the reasons I'm working with Awaken is because, you know, we are doing ketamine therapy. Ketamine is the only psychedelic that we can legally use in Britain, except in a research study. And getting research funds is challenging. But we've been working with Celia Morgan, professor at University of Exeter, and she did a really elegant study. So up till now, most people have used ketamine to treat depression as if they were using an anesthetic to treat depression. They would give the ketamine, people would have an experience for half an hour, and then they go home and come back next week and have another dose. What she said was, why don't we use ketamine in the same way as my group and others have been using psychedelics, have the experience, and then really push the psychotherapy. So she set up this program called the CARE program, which is ketamine and addiction research, and in Exeter. And what she's shown is that ketamine, a dose of ketamine given 3 times over 4 weeks, plus psychotherapy, can produce better outcomes than 12 weeks of ordinary psychotherapy treatment for alcoholism. It's a more concentrated therapy. It has very good outcomes because you're using the ketamine to facilitate the psychotherapy, yeah, just as you do with psychedelics for depression. And now we're doing that for depression. So Awaken is now using the same principle. It's ketamine plus psychotherapy for everything we do.
And how much better is it? What are the stats that you know so far? Well,
we know from her stats it's nearly as good as LSD for alcoholism. Although we haven't done a head-to-head. She had, very good outcomes, and we're collecting the data. We haven't done enough. We've only done about 100 patients so far, but we are collecting the data in the same way as the NHS collects its data, because we think that the outcomes are actually generally pretty good. At least 40%, 50% of people do really well. So if we can accumulate that information over the next year or so, and we can then go to the NHS and say, look, you're going to get better outcomes for investing in us than you are if you're doing other approaches. And maybe then we'll get it on the NHS, which is, of course, where we want to be, because it's unfortunate we can only give it to people that can afford it at present.
And is the addiction, all addictions, sex, gambling, drugs, or is it just alcohol?
Right. So at present, we are offering our treatment for alcohol and for depression, for eating disorders. Those are the 3 main ones we're offering it for. But we are doing research. Celia Morgan is doing research with ketamine for gambling, internet addiction. And the great thing about psychedelics is that because they affect the whole of the brain rather than just a single receptor, they have this broader potential. So it's very hard to think of what kind of drug would you use to treat gambling addiction, because gambling is not a drug. But if you disrupt circuits, you can disrupt circuits common circuits which underpin all different kinds of addiction. And the science shows us this is again very science driven. I mean, I'm working with Awaken because in 1999 I published the first ever paper in the world showing there was a circuit for heroin addiction, which by the way was the same circuit for cocaine addiction was the same circuit for eating. But
wow.
we couldn't, it's taken me 20 years to be able to get into a situation where we can disrupt the circuits to actually produce clinical benefit.
I mean, it's incredible that you've got this far, but the frustration in it taking so long when you recognized what worked so long ago must drive you to want to take drugs.
They often do lie me down and inject me, you're right. Only for experimental purposes. No, I'm too old to go in the trials now, they say.
Oh.
And I'm too, yes, no.
But that must be unbelievably, I mean, it was, for me, when I've witnessed personally through my clients, the untold suffering from all addictions and from depression, but there wouldn't be a single person listening to this conversation who isn't very close to or knows someone who is impacted by their own depression, their own addiction, or someone that they love. I mean, it is that common.
Unquestionable.
And that if we have this kind of powerhouse of both psychotherapy with a psychedelic that can change and transform the speed of the outcome that people can trust in, that really is saving lives. I mean, huge lives.
Oh, I think so. I mean, I've done a back of the envelope calculation on the LSD data. So if you count, it's 55 years now since the LSD was banned in America, and effectively it was banned around the rest of the world within a couple of years.
That was Richard Nixon, wasn't it?
That was Nixon, yes. So 55 years, about 100 million people have died prematurely from alcohol addiction. And let's say that psychedelic therapy would cure 10%. So that's 10 million lives saved. How many lives have been saved by the ban of psychedelics? I mean, probably none, but let's suppose they did actually deter some people. So maybe 1,000, maybe even 1 million. It's not that at all. But the reality is the equation's so much more in favor of the benefits. And actually, the banning of these drugs as medicine,
bonkers. Yeah.
It was vindictive. It was another attempt to undermine people that wanted change, whether they wanted change in medicine or wanted political change. It was the war in Vietnam was what drove the war on drugs, because Nixon couldn't win an election supporting the war in Vietnam, so he deflected people to a war on drugs. And then pursued the war on drugs because drugs became public enemy #1 in America, as he said. Very successful. He won every state except Maine.
But why is it taking so long to undo it? And why is it's still illegal here, right? So LSD is your drug of choice for all of
No, we use psilocybin all the time. Our preferred psychedelic is psilocybin, working quite a lot with DMT. Psilocybin is
mushrooms, isn't it? The psychoactive
mushrooms. Yeah, for the first, yes, because obviously they're very safe. Millions of, well, in fact, it's an interesting story. If I got time, I'll share it with you. So when we were going to do the first psilocybin study with patients, we approached the MHRA and said, we want to do this study in resistant depression. They said, well, where's the investigator's brochure? Where's all the evidence of safety in animal models, blah, blah, blah. And we said, well, there isn't any. And they said, well, how can you do a study? We said, well, but what we can tell you is that we know, from government data, about 1 million young people every year were using mushrooms for the last 20 years. There's never been a death, so it's probably pretty safe. And they said, all right. That was good. That was one of the very few times that reason has prevailed in the MHRA.
When you were saying about 10 million people who've 100 million people who've died and 10% could be saved, well, I was thinking that I know very well evidence-based from research, for every death that's cut short, like a death out of time, which a lot of addiction deaths are, whether it's alcohol or drugs, 8 or 9 people are very significantly affected.
Exactly, is this yeah, quite. So you're looking at what's that's 1 billion people as opposed to 100 million. Yeah, quite.
And often for generations.
Yes, it's in the family, isn't it? It's
because the addiction patterns get passed down both epigenetically and behaviorally from generation to generation until someone stops using that particular pain-stopping model of operating, as it were, functioning or dysfunctioning. And so, I mean, I really, really support you in what you're doing in the research. I'm so grateful for what you've done for all your decades of work and over 400 papers, but also for the clinic that they're now, although it is private, at least it's the beginning and it's access for people to begin to change their lives in a much more effective way.
Exactly.
Thank you very much.